Elijah Rune preached the end of the world, but his daughter Ember was the one who ended his, escaping his death cult at just 9 years old and bringing justice to every soul he tried to erase. In the remote wilderness of northern Idaho, far from cities and cell towers, a man named Elijah Rune built a community that lived by his word alone. To his followers, he was more than a leader. He was a prophet. They called him the last voice, the only man who had been chosen to speak for the end times. Over the years, he convinced dozens of people to leave their lives behind, careers, families, even their names. They sold their homes, gave away their belongings, and followed him into the deep woods where he promised salvation from a dying world. It was the beginning of something dark, hidden beneath the surface of faith and fear. Among the first to join Elijah was his own daughter, Ember. She was only 4 when her mother died under what Elijah called divine circumstances. No autopsy was ever done, and the death was never reported. After that, Ember became something else to him. Not just a child, but a symbol. He told his followers that she had been touched by fire and survived, a sign from the heavens. She was given a title, the Chosen Spark. Followers were told she would help lead them through the coming collapse into a reborn world. At 9, Ember didn't fully understand the weight of those words, but she knew enough to stay quiet when her father was in one of his moods. The compound Elijah built was deep in the forest, unreachable by car in winter. There were cabins made from pine logs, a large wooden meeting hall, and a central lodge where Elijah stayed. There was no electricity, no running water. The people lived off stored food, firewood, and a belief that Elijah knew something no one else did. He held sermons twice a day and punished those who questioned him. Followers were given new names, stripped of contact with the outside world, and made to participate in purification rituals meant to rid them of worldly sin. Some of these rituals were violent. Some were never spoken of again. Ember was often kept apart from the others. She lived in a small room attached to Elijah's quarters and was rarely allowed to speak to anyone unless he permitted it. But she saw things. She noticed when certain faces disappeared and were never mentioned again. She watched as the number of followers slowly shrank, even though no one ever said they were leaving. Some left in the night, but most, Ember feared, were taken into the forest for the rituals and never returned. Despite her silence, Ember's mind was sharp. She memorized patterns, who slept where, when people vanished, and where Elijah went at night. She wasn't allowed books, but she learned through observation. The more she watched, the more she understood. This wasn't a holy place. It was a trap. Her father wasn't preparing anyone for the end. He was ending them. And somewhere deep in her chest, Ember felt something new. Not just fear, but defiance. She would not disappear like the others. Not without a fight. It was a night colder than most, the kind where the wind seemed to whisper through the trees like voices trying to warn her. Ember lay still on the floor of her small room, the thin blanket offering little warmth. The fire had gone out hours earlier, but she didn't dare relight it. She didn't want to draw attention. Across the compound in the meeting hall, Elijah had called a cleansing, something Ember had learned to fear. No one was allowed to attend except those being purified and a select few loyal followers. Everyone else had to stay inside, lights off, no sound. But Ember couldn't stay put. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears as she crept from her bed and pressed her eye to the knot in the wooden wall. From this crack, if she angled just right, she could see part of the meeting hall through the trees. What she saw that night would change everything. A teenage boy, barely older than 15, stood tied to a stone slab that had been placed at the center of the hall's clearing. He didn't scream. He didn't move. Two robed men stood behind him, silent. Elijah appeared holding a torch, speaking words Ember couldn't hear. She watched the fire rise, shadows flickering like demons across the snow-covered ground. Then came the silence, the kind that crushed everything around it. After that, nothing. No boy. Just smoke curling into the dark sky. Ember slid back into her room and curled under her blanket, her mind racing. She couldn't close her eyes. She saw the fire every time she blinked. The boy's face haunted her. She didn't know his name, but she remembered him helping her carry firewood the week before. Now he was gone, like the others. There was no more guessing, no more pretending this place could be saved. The next morning, Elijah was different. He looked calm, lighter somehow. He preached about rebirth, about the fire making way for purity. The others nodded, eyes hollow. They'd stopped asking questions long ago. That's when Ember knew she was alone. No one was coming to save her. Over the next few days, she began to plan. She went to the woodpile under the guise of chores and dug until she found what she'd seen weeks earlier, an old map, probably, dropped by a lost hiker. It was faded, but the forest paths were still visible. She studied it in the dark, memorizing every turn, every river, every ridge. She knew she had only one chance. The next storm would come soon, and in bad weather, no one would chase her. She waited, checking the skies, counting rations hidden in a hollowed-out log. She stole a flashlight from Elijah's lodge when no one was watching. On the night snow started falling thick and fast. She slipped out, leaving behind everything she knew. She didn't cry. She didn't look back. She just ran into the dark woods toward the world that had forgotten her, carrying only a stolen map and the burning truth she could never unsee. 2 days after Ember vanished into the storm, a snowplow driver spotted. A small figure collapsed by the side of a back road, miles from any town. Her clothes were torn, her lips blue, and she clutched a plastic bag containing a folded map stained with blood. At first, no one understood who she was or where she came from. She couldn't speak, not because she didn't want to, but because she had spent years being told silence was survival. She had forgotten what safety felt like. At the local hospital, nurses whispered about her haunted eyes and the numbers carved faintly into her wrist, a symbol used by Elijah Rune to mark the worthy. Police were called, child services, then the FBI. When Ember finally spoke, her words came slowly, like each one weighed 100 pounds. But she gave them what they needed: coordinates, names, routines, a truth buried beneath snow and scripture. The raid on Elijah's compound was fast and brutal. FBI agents stormed through the trees just before dawn. What they found shook even the most hardened investigators. Behind the meeting hall, they uncovered shallow graves, some barely covered with pine needles. In the basement of Elijah's cabin, there were shackles bolted into the walls and symbols drawn in ash. The smell of burned flesh lingered in the walls. 5 cult members tried to flee and were tackled in the snow. Elijah didn't run. He stood in the center of the compound with a blank expression, hands raised, as if surrendering was part of his prophecy. Survivors, what remained of them, were in shock, some wept. Others refused to speak. A few screamed that Elijah had been betrayed, and the world would now burn without his guidance. They didn't understand yet that their prison was broken. For years, they had been told the world outside was full of monsters. But inside the compound, the true monster had ruled. The media swarmed in days later, hungry for every detail. The story spread nationwide. A child had escaped a secret cult hidden in the mountains and led authorities to a place filled with horror. But what the headlines didn't say was that Ember remembered every name, every missing face. She didn't cry during interviews. She didn't speak to the cameras. Her focus was on the stack of files placed in front of her. At the federal office, photographs of bones, recovered journals, Elijah's coded writings. She pointed at pages with calm certainty. That symbol meant death. That phrase meant disposal. That pit behind the lodge, it was called the hearth. That was where the chosen went when they failed. Elijah was charged with multiple counts of murder, abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. 5 of his closest followers were charged as accomplices. The rest were placed in rehabilitation programs, though many still believed he had done nothing wrong. Ember was moved into protective custody, given a new identity and a new home. But even as she started school under a false name, she kept a notebook in her backpack. In it were the initials of every person who had vanished from the compound. She wrote them down by candlelight, one letter at a time. The cult was gone, but the story wasn't over. Not for her. 3 years passed, but Ember never stopped watching. Though she was now 12 and lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood with a foster family who tried their best to offer normalcy, the fire inside her never dimmed. Her days were filled with school and chores, but her nights belonged to the past. When her foster parents slept, she sat at her desk with an old laptop, gifted by a teacher who thought she'd become a writer, and searched the dark corners of the internet. She wasn't looking for stories, she was looking for ghosts. The trial had ended quickly. Elijah was sentenced to life in prison without parole. 5 of his top followers were locked away with him, but Ember remembered more names. Not everyone who served Elijah had been punished. Some had vanished before the compound was raided. They had known what was coming and slipped into the world unnoticed. The court said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue them. The FBI moved on. But Ember didn't. She had memorized faces, voices, tattoos. She remembered who held the ropes, who blocked the doors, who turned their backs during the cleansings. Her journal now held pages of notes, cross-referenced names, sketches, even possible locations. She taught herself how to search property records, use image-matching software, and decode encrypted forums where ex-cult members sometimes left breadcrumbs. And when she found something, she didn't call attention to herself. She packaged the truth and sent it anonymously. The first target was Brother Samuel, real name Mason Klein. He had overseen the compound's ritual punishments and vanished the day Ember escaped. She found him working under a different name at a remote greenhouse in Montana. He lived in a trailer, far off grid, using an old alias that matched a fake identity card. Ember emailed the FBI a file with photos, timeline data, and the stolen logbook entries that connected him to at least 4 deaths. He was arrested a week later. The news barely covered it. Then came Sister Gail, now going by Dana Laurel. She had posed as a caretaker at the compound, but was responsible for preparing victims for Elijah's ceremonies. Ember found her through a missing persons database. Someone had filed a report years earlier, not knowing she had joined the cult. Dana now worked in a wellness clinic in Arizona. Ember mailed the FBI physical copies of compound surveillance footage, old recordings Ember had taken herself, hidden away in a boot heel. Dana was taken into custody days later. One by one, Ember hunted them down. She never used the same method twice. She created burner emails, fake tipster identities, sometimes posing as distant relatives seeking lost family members. By the end of that year, 5 more people had been arrested or exposed. Each time, Ember crossed their name from her journal with a red pen. No one knew who was behind the tips. Investigators assumed it was a retired agent or a surviving cult member finally speaking out. Ember never took credit. She didn't need applause. She only needed justice. She wasn't just remembering the past. She was rewriting it. One name at a time. By the time Ember turned 15, the world had nearly forgotten the story of the mountain cult. News cycles had moved on, documentaries faded from streaming services, and survivors had scattered into lives they barely understood. But Ember remembered everything. Her body had grown, her voice had changed, but her purpose had only sharpened. She was no longer a victim hiding in the dark. She had become something else entirely, a quiet force, fueled by the weight of lost names and unfinished justice. Elijah Rune died in prison that year, stabbed by another inmate during a routine transfer. The official report called it inmate conflict, but Ember knew it was more than that. Word had gotten around. People inside knew what Elijah had done, what kind of pain he had worshipped. Some saw his death as karma. Others saw it as closure. Ember didn't feel much of anything. She didn't want Elijah dead. She wanted him to watch everything he built fall apart. But even in death, he wouldn't escape what she had planned. Ember launched her podcast 4 months after Elijah's death. She recorded in a closet using a cheap microphone and voice modulator. She never revealed her name, never showed her face. She called the show Red Spark, a nod to what Elijah had once called her, a name he tried to twist into something holy. Now she used it as a weapon. Each episode focused on a different victim from the compound. Not just how they died, but who they were. She read journal entries, old letters, even reconstructed moments using scraps of memory. She spoke calmly, directly, her voice steady, as she told the world what really happened in the forest. Listeners grew fast. At first, it was just survivors of other cults, people looking for connection or understanding. But soon, true crime fans and journalists took notice. Ember began getting messages, some from other cult survivors, others from people who thought they might have missing relatives tied to Elijah's group. She dug through missing persons databases, matched photos, tracked names, and connected dots the FBI had long forgotten. Each time she confirmed a name, she told their story on the podcast. She gave the dead what Elijah had tried to erase, a voice. Eventually, a retired detective reached out and asked to speak. He had worked the original case and had followed Ember's podcast for weeks. She debated ignoring him, but curiosity won. When they finally spoke over a secure line, he didn't ask who she was. He told her thank you. Because of her, the FBI reopened the investigation. More bodies were being identified. More names added to the list of confirmed victims. Families were getting closure. At 16, Ember finally came forward. On a national interview. She removed the mask. Her voice shook, but she didn't flinch. She told her story. How she escaped. How she hunted those responsible. How she turned pain into purpose. The world saw her not as a survivor, but as the fire that refused to go out. The girl who escaped had become the one who brought it all down.